Hi and welcome to another week of the Oasis Global Gathering. Unbelievably, we're not too far off celebrating the Global Gathering's first birthday, but just in case you've not been with us before, my name's Nathan Jones and I'm one of the ministers of Oasis Church Waterloo, alongside Steve Chalke, who's our founding minister and who you'll see a little later on this morning. We're starting a new series today called Nevertheless, She Persisted. This is a phrase that was first used in the US Senate by a Republican called Mitch McConnell, who was attempting to silence another senator, Elizabeth Warren, when she was objecting to Jeff Sessions, somebody with a frankly terrible record on civil rights, being confirmed as the US Attorney General. Since then, Nevertheless, She Persisted has been adopted by feminists across the world as a rallying cry, trying to ensure that women's voices get heard. So over this series, we'll hear from women in Oasis Church Bath and Waterloo, telling the stories of women in the Bible. They're stories which acknowledge pain and struggle, but at the same time show us all how to hold on to hope. Danielle Welch, who's part of the leadership team at Oasis Church Waterloo and the Chief Operating Officer for Oasis, kicks us off this morning. Before that though, let's pause and pray together. We're going to put some words on the screen and some of the lines are in bold, and invite you wherever you are to join in with those words in bold. Come now and rest with the God of heaven who has made his home on earth. Christ dwells among us and is one with us. Come now and rest with the highest of all creation who lives among the least. Christ journeys with the rejected and welcomes the weary. Come now, all who thirst, and drink the water of life. Come now, all who hunger, and be filled with good things. Come now, all who seek, and be warmed by the fire of love. Amen. Now, Steve's going to speak to us about a conference that we're running later this week.
We tend to hear about and think about long COVID in terms of physical symptoms. Symptoms such as lethargy, difficulty with breathing, insomnia, coughs and headaches. But for countless children and young people, long COVID will be measured in other terms. The symptoms, a lifelong loss of confidence, a loss of employment opportunities, a loss of well-being. The damage to the mental health of some children and young people caused by the COVID crisis will last all their lives, unless there's a large-scale increase in services to support them. The truth is that even before the pandemic, children's mental health services were struggling. In the year before the lockdowns began, referrals increased by a staggering 35%, while the number of children who were successfully able to access any treatment at all went up by just 4%. Then, last July, a study undertaken by the NHS found that 1 in 6 children were suffering with a probable clinical mental health condition. Here's the thing. We just don't know what the long-term consequences of any of this will be. But nor do we know what the increased impact of the present lockdown will add to all of this. What is clear is that the level of underlying mental health problems is continuing to escalate, and that the impact on the most vulnerable children in society will be the most profound. So that's why I'd like to invite you to a free webinar. How can the government, charities, churches, schools, youth workers, family workers and the youth justice system all work together to support the children and young people who are most at risk of being crushed and confused, vulnerable to exploitation and even of falling into the criminal justice system itself? Levelling Up for the COVID generation will take place this coming Wednesday, the 10th of February, from 4 till 5 p.m. I'll be joined by the Lord Chancellor, the Secretary of State for Justice, Robert Buckland, and by the Children's Commissioner, Anne Longfield, to help explore this issue and answer your questions. For your free ticket and to register your questions, your insights and your points of view, go to www.oasiswaterloo.org/level-up. I hope to see you there.
Thanks, Steve. And here's that sign-up link again in case you missed it. Also, if you have any ideas for topics for our Connect slots, if there's anything from across the Oasis family that you'd like to learn more about, please do post in the comments or email me. We'd love to hear what you think. So it's almost time for Danielle to speak to us. But before she does, here's Anna with today's Bible reading.
The reading for today is from Matthew chapter 1, verse 1 to 6, the genealogy of Jesus. A record of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac. Isaac, the father of Jacob. Jacob, the father of Judah and his brothers. Judah, the father of Perez, and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar. Perez, the father of Hezron. Hezron, the father of Ram. Ram, the father of Amminadab. Amminadab, the father of Nahshon. Nahshon, the father of Salmon. Salmon, the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab. Boaz, the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth. Obed, the father of Jesse, and Jesse, the father of King David.
Hi, my name's Danielle and I'm part of the team at Oasis Waterloo. Almost a year ago, at Oasis Church Waterloo, we began a series called Hooray for the Matriarchy, telling stories of women from the Bible. We talked about the forgotten voices of women. We learned from Hagar and Deborah, and then COVID happened and everything changed. So for the next few weeks on the Global Gathering, we're going to return to these stories. 1 year on, and I think they're more relevant than ever. We've called this new series, Nevertheless, She Persisted, a phrase that became an internet meme after it was used against US Senator Warren, when she refused to be silenced in a debate. We're not trying to get party political. The phrase came to stand as a motto for women at the ready to break barriers. It resonated with women who had their own stories of being silenced. This is important not just for the rights and inclusion of women, but for all who find their voices silenced or disregarded. Who gets heard? Which stories shape our thinking? These are questions of justice, and the Bible places justice at the centre of what it is to know and to follow God. So what might women's stories teach us all? I think women's stories occupy a special place in Scripture. They remind us that how we read the Bible really matters, and through history as well as today, we have not always read it well. You may know there are 111 women named in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, and very many more who are unnamed. Some we can easily recall, Ruth, Esther, the books of the Bible named after them. But many we've never noticed, or certainly never heard preached about. Yet the women's stories are there. Anna read to us from Matthew chapter 1, listing the ancestors of Jesus, beginning with the patriarchs. Time and again in the Bible we're told that God is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. In the church, right from Sunday school, we teach stories about the male heroes of faith, Abraham, Moses, Joseph, David, Samson, Gideon. The list goes on. But listen to that reading from Matthew 1 carefully, and you'll notice that in a break with how ancestors are normally recalled, 3 women are named: Tamar, Rahab, Bathsheba, and if you read a little further, Mary too. Their inclusion is intriguing, but it's not an utter surprise. The Bible is a remarkable history. Most histories are written by those who conquered, those who won, and those therefore who control the narrative. But the Hebrew Bible tells the story of the Jewish people who are constantly conquered and exiled. And in that context, the Bible is actually often subversive, often disruptive. We should always look for the voices from the margins of the story that it tells. The Bible's written in a time and culture completely formed by patriarchy, a system where men hold power and women are largely excluded from power. And yet the women's stories are there. The Bible is rich with stories of women who are oppressed, but who sometimes have agency. Women who are silenced, but who sometimes make their voices heard. Many of the women in the Hebrew Bible whose stories we know are foreigners, outsiders in Israel with no status, and women suffer more than any others in the biblical text, and God is often silent about their suffering. Women's stories aren't the centre of the text. They appear and disappear. We get a little bit about them. We never know what happens to them after that. Their feelings and actions are unexplored. Their story arcs don't get completed. In a text that's often about power and nation building, the men's stories are the point, but the women's stories are there. Because God is the God of Abraham, Sarah, Hagar and Keturah, Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob, Rachel, Leah, Bilhah and Zilpah. While Moses parts the waters of the Red Sea, it's Miriam who leads the people of Israel across with dancing. When Israel sends spies into Canaan looking for their promised land, it's Rahab who saves them. Deborah leads the people of Israel in peacetime as well as in war, a war that's won when Jael, another woman, puts a tent peg through Sisera's skull. Tamar, Dinah, the granddaughter of Joseph, called Shirah, who built 3 whole cities, the daughters of Zelophehad, Hannah, Esther, Abigail, queen of Egypt, Huldah, the prophet, Rizpah, who sits in the desert with the corpses of her sons for 6 months to demand justice from King David and gets it. We don't have time for all of their stories today, but even to say their names is important because we don't. Time and again, the fate of the people of Israel pivots on the actions of women. The women's stories are there. And in the New Testament, there are 22 women in the Gospels whose interactions with Jesus are recorded. We don't know many of their names, but we know their faith and often their courage. The woman at the well who brings a whole village with her. The Syrophoenician woman who calls Jesus out on his use of racist language. The woman, just the woman, caught in adultery, who walks away uncondemned. The woman who washes Jesus' feet with her tears. The woman who gives away her last coin in the temple offering. The women who wait at the cross while Jesus' male disciples flee. The women who watch his burial, who visit the tomb, who are the first witnesses of the resurrection and are not believed. And in the early church, Priscilla, Lydia, Junia. In the Bible, women lead. They bear witness to suffering and oppression. They head up the resistance. They unsettle. They bring difference and disruption. The women's stories are there. Theologian Dr. Will Gaffney says this about the Bible. God is in the text and God is behind the text and beyond the text. In the characters the authors and editors hold up for us and in the ones they neglect and turn away from. In the Canaanites and Moabites, in the trafficked and enslaved, in the women and the children, in the Gentiles and the foreigners, in the conquered and the subjugated. Now is always the time to listen and to learn from the margins, from outside the centre of the text. The women's stories are there, and we need to tell them well. In this last year, through a pandemic, we've had plenty of cause to reflect on what kind of leadership we need, globally and in our own communities. Sadly, we've had plenty of cause to reflect on structures of power and privilege that create inequality. We've watched as women have played a decisive role, as ever, in world leadership, with headlines commenting on the difference in their handling of the pandemic. Women, and particularly Black women and women of colour, have led the way on justice, on the climate emergency, on political change. Not simply because of their gender, because of their skills, their experience, their character, but perhaps also because they are less invested in the status quo. So, for the next few weeks, we'll be hearing stories of women from the Bible. It's impossible to read these and not be directed towards liberation, to think about power, to be disrupted and confronted with injustice, as well as inspired. For those of us who have experienced being excluded or marginalised or unheard, these women's stories speak to us. For those of us who have benefited from privilege and power, these women's stories speak to us. For all of us, the women's stories are there. Let's celebrate them and use them for good.
Thanks, Danielle. Danielle said the women's stories are there and we need to tell them well. Let's take some time to reflect together on those words and to answer some questions. Are there areas in your life where you feel powerless? And if so, are there practical steps that you can take, people you can talk to help you towards equality? Or if you're in a position of leadership, of privilege, who are the powerless, the people on the margins in your life? What practical steps can you take this week to be better at distributing power? How can you tell their stories better? Just before we finish, I wanted to leave you with a quick reminder. A couple of weeks ago on the Global Gathering, I talked about giving, and while we don't want to put any pressure at all on those who are struggling financially due to the pandemic or other circumstances, it's also true to say that our churches in Bath and Waterloo have gone almost a year without the regular income which comes from those of us who give in our weekly offerings during their services. As you'd imagine, this is a significant amount of income that we've lost. So if you were able to follow the links on the screen and maybe even just set up a small standing order for the amount that you would usually throw into the collection bucket, we would be hugely grateful. And to those of you who already do this, a massive thank you again. That's it for this week. We're going to end by singing together, and as ever, the words will show up on the bottom of the screen if you'd like to join in. See you next week. And God bless you. You are a refuge, you have no borders. When I was a stranger knocking at your door, you took me in with no questions and no conditions. When I was a sinner running from your grace, you called me friend. call me friend. And there are no